Dr. Emily Watson, a historian who focused on early 20th century American family life, had attended many estate auctions across New England. Still, something about the Blackwood collection felt unusual. The auctioneer explained that the items had been found inside a sealed storage room of a Victorian mansion in Providence, Rhode Island, untouched for more than 100 years. Then came Lot 47. The auctioneer lifted a large, richly decorated frame and announced it as a formal family photograph from around 1903, taken in a professional studio, with a starting bid of $50. Emily raised her paddle at once, drawn to the photograph's sharp detail and balanced composition. The image showed a well-dressed family of 7, arranged in the classic formal style of the time. The parents sat in the center, with 5 children of different ages positioned carefully around them. The father looked refined in a dark suit, while the mother wore an elaborate gown decorated with detailed beadwork common in formal clothing of that era. As the bidding continued, Emily studied the faces through her small magnifying glass. 4 of the children wore the serious, controlled expressions typical of formal portraits from 1903. Standing stiffly with folded hands and steady gazes, the parents held the dignified posture expected of successful Americans of their time. But the youngest child immediately caught Emily's attention and refused to let go of it. While the rest of the family maintained perfect composure, the little boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, showed a broad, joyful grin that felt completely out of place in such a solemn photograph. His smile clashed so sharply with the serious mood of the others that it created an uneasy contrast. Emily won the photograph at $180, far more than she had planned to spend, but her instincts told her the image held a story worth uncovering. As she carefully wrapped the frame for transport, she noticed a small brass nameplate attached at the bottom. It read, "The Blackwood Family, Providence, Rhode Island, October 1903. Back in her office at Brown University, Emily soon realized that the boy's strange smile was only the beginning of one of the most unsettling family mysteries in New England history. Under the bright lights of her research lab, Dr. Watson examined every detail of the Blackwood family portrait. Using high-resolution digital scanning, she created enlarged images that revealed details impossible to see with the naked eye. What she found made the boy's grin even more disturbing. The studio setting itself was completely normal for 1903. There was an ornate Victorian chair, heavy curtains, and carefully arranged lighting that suggested significant expense. The photographer was clearly skilled, indicating that this was an important family record rather than a casual picture. The family members were arranged in a traditional hierarchical order. James Blackwood, the family patriarch, appeared to be in his mid-40s, carrying the stern confidence of a successful businessman. His wife Margaret showed the polished elegance expected of the wife of a wealthy merchant. Their 4 older children, 3 daughters and 1 son, seemed to range from about 8 to 16 years old, all holding the calm expressions expected during formal photography. But when Emily zoomed in on the youngest child, troubling details became clear. The boy's smile was not simply cheerful. It looked knowing, almost clever. His eyes showed an awareness that seemed far beyond his young age, as if he understood something others did not. There was something about his expression that suggested he knew more than the photographer or future viewers were meant to see. Even more unsettling was what Emily noticed about the family's body language. While the arrangement looked normal at first glance, closer inspection revealed subtle signs of tension. The older children's eyes showed hints of fear or anxiety, carefully controlled but visible under magnification. Margaret Blackwood's hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles appeared white through her gloves, and James Blackwood's jaw seemed firmly set despite his neutral expression. Only the youngest child appeared fully relaxed and genuinely pleased. This sharp contrast suggested that either he did not understand what was making the rest of the family uncomfortable, or he understood it completely and found it entertaining. Emily began researching the Blackwood family's history to understand what circumstances could explain the strange dynamics captured in such an ordinary-looking portrait. Records at the Providence Historical Society showed that the Blackwoods had been influential figures in Rhode Island's textile and shipping industries throughout the late 1800s. James Blackwood, had built a large fortune through smart investments in manufacturing and import businesses, establishing his family as one of Providence's respected merchant dynasties. But as Emily dug deeper, she found gaps and contradictions that suggested the family's polished public image did not reflect their private reality. Birth records showed a normal pattern for 4 of the 5 children, but the youngest child's paperwork stood out as unusual. Thomas Blackwood's birth certificate listed his birth date as March 15, 1898, making him 5 years old at the time of the 1903 photograph. However, Emily uncovered earlier family documents that mentioned a different Thomas Blackwood, described not as a biological son but as the family's ward, with notes about unusual circumstances and a need for special care. Even more puzzling were references in James Blackwood's business letters to special arrangements for the boy and payments made to medical specialists and private tutors. The sums involved were large, suggesting that Thomas required extensive and specialized attention. One letter stood out in particular. Written by Margaret Blackwood to her sister in August 1903, just 2 months before the photograph was taken, it read, "Thomas continues to present difficulties that demand constant watchfulness. James insists that we maintain the appearance of a normal family, but the boy's nature makes this harder each day. We have agreed to the family portrait as he wishes, though I worry about what others might see if they look too closely." The letter's tone made it clear that Thomas's presence created ongoing strain that the parents were trying to hide from society. But what kind of nature required such careful control? And why would James insist on including the boy in a formal family portrait if he caused so much concern? Emily realized she needed to look beyond public records and examine medical and legal documents that might explain Thomas's unusual status and the family's anxiety about his behavior. Her search through medical archives revealed a troubling pattern. Beginning in 1899, when Thomas would have been about 1 year old, the family had consulted specialists in Boston, New York, and even Philadelphia. The medical notes, written carefully due to the era's privacy customs, described a child with unusual behavioral and intellectual traits that confused the doctors who examined him. In 1901, Dr. Marcus Whitmore of Boston Children's Hospital wrote that the child showed normal physical growth but displayed mental and emotional traits inconsistent with typical childhood development. His intelligence appeared advanced for his age, while his emotional responses raised serious concerns. Notes from Dr. Sarah Chen at New York Presbyterian Hospital in 1902 were even more alarming. She described Thomas as showing remarkable intellectual precocity, capable of complex thought far beyond what would be expected of a child his age. At the same time, his empathy seemed severely lacking. He showed no distress when others were hurt and appeared to find their pain amusing. The doctor's discussions focused on behaviors that modern psychology would recognize as early signs of antisocial development. But in 1903, limited understanding of child psychology left physicians unable to give clear solutions. Emily found letters between James Blackwood and Dr. Whitmore discussing ways to manage Thomas's behavior. The doctor advised close supervision to prevent harm to others and suggested maintaining normal family routines in hopes of encouraging healthier social behavior. Vigilance, however, was essential. The family portrait now carried new meaning. It had been taken during a time when the Blackwoods were struggling to manage a child whose psychological development deeply worried them. Thomas's strange grin no longer looked like innocent joy, but like the expression of someone who understood the family's fear far better than a typical 5-year-old should. Emily's most disturbing discovery came later, hidden in legal documents that revealed what ultimately happened to Thomas Blackwood. At the Rhode Island State Archives, she requested access to court records connected to the Blackwood estate. What she found made the boy's smile in the portrait even more chilling. In January 1904, just 3 months after the photograph was taken, James Blackwood filed a petition with the Providence family court, asking that Thomas be declared a ward of the state due to dangerous behavioral tendencies that threatened the family's safety. The petition included detailed reports of incidents throughout 1903. The court documents, sealed for decades because they involved a minor, described a deeply troubling pattern. Thomas H. had been involved in incidents with family pets, household servants, and even his siblings that showed a disturbing lack of normal emotional response and a clear enjoyment of others' suffering. Margaret Blackwood testified in a closed session that she had found Thomas smiling with clear pleasure while deliberately hurting the family cat. Servants had also reported the boy attempting to injure them through deliberate acts disguised as mischief. Most disturbing were the reports involving Thomas's siblings. The records showed that the older children were increasingly afraid to be alone with him and had told their parents that the boy enjoyed frightening them and had threatened to harm them while smiling. Dr. Whitmore supported the family's petition, stating that Thomas showed traits consistent with what alienists of the time called moral insanity, an inability to form normal emotional bonds combined with pleasure in causing distress. Without intensive institutional care, such children often grew into adults who posed serious dangers to society. The court approved the petition, and Thomas was committed to the Rhode Island State Hospital for Nervous and Mental Disorders in February 1904. The commitment papers stated that he would remain there until doctors decided he no longer posed a danger to himself or others. Emily realized the family portrait had been taken during the final months Thomas lived with the Blackwoods, when plans for his institutionalization were already in motion. His knowing smile now seemed like the expression of a child fully aware of the fear and chaos he caused, and who found it deeply amusing. Emily later gained special permission to review the Rhode Island State Hospital's historical records related to Thomas. Her academic credentials allowed her access to his institutional file, which detailed a child whose disturbing behavior continued and intensified after commitment. Hospital records written by Dr. Henry Morrison described a young patient with high intelligence, but a complete absence of empathy. In March 1904, Morrison noted that Thomas showed no sadness at being separated from his family, and seemed to treat his situation as an interesting experiment rather than a punishment or treatment. Staff records also described Thomas's unusual ability to manipulate both patients and caregivers through surface charm and apparent cooperation that hid his true intentions, confirming that the unsettling grin captured in the 1903 photograph had been an early warning of something far darker. Several incident reports described Thomas intentionally provoking other patients into violent reactions while keeping up an image of innocence himself. Yet the most frightening part of Thomas's institutional file was the staff's growing realization that standard treatment methods were having no impact on his condition. One evaluation stated that the child appeared incapable of true remorse or emotional growth. It noted that he could imitate proper behavior when it suited his goals, but showed no real signs of inner change or psychological improvement. Emily also found letters exchanged between Dr. Morrison and James Blackwood about the family's continued financial responsibility for Thomas's care. These letters showed that while the Blackwoods were paying for his treatment, they had asked that all updates about Thomas be handled through their lawyer, rather than shared directly with family members. In a letter written in 1905, Dr. Morrison informed the family's attorney that Mr. Blackwood believed limiting information was necessary for the emotional health of his wife and remaining children. While this reaction was understandable given the trauma surrounding Thomas's commitment, Dr. Morrison noted that it made the possibility of Thomas ever returning to his biological family increasingly unlikely. The institutional records followed Thomas through adolescence, documenting a continued pattern of manipulation, emotional emptiness, and traits that modern psychology would clearly identify as psychopathic. Emily realized she was reading one of the earliest carefully recorded cases of childhood psychopathy in American medical history. Emily's investigation into the Blackwood family's life after Thomas was institutionalized revealed how deeply his presence had affected them all. Using newspaper articles, social records, and personal letters, she traced how the family rebuilt their lives after the events of 1903 and 1904. All four of the older Blackwood children left Providence within a few years of Thomas's removal, despite the family's strong business roots in the city. Maria, the oldest daughter, married and moved to Boston in 1906. The two middle daughters were sent to finishing schools in New York and stayed on the East Coast afterward. Even James Jr., the eldest son who was expected to take over the family business, moved to California in 1908. Margaret Blackwood's health appeared to decline sharply after Thomas was institutionalized. Emily found mentions in society columns of Margaret taking long periods of rest for her health, followed by later descriptions of her living almost as an invalid and rarely appearing in public after 1905. James Blackwood slowly sold off his Providence business interests and eventually moved the family to a smaller estate in rural Connecticut, seeking a quieter life away from rumors and public attention after Thomas's sudden removal from the household. Emily's most revealing discovery came from a collection of letters between Margaret Blackwood and her sister, preserved in a private family archive. Written between 1904 and 1910, these letters offered a raw look into the family's emotional recovery. In one letter from 1905, Margaret wrote that they now lived with the understanding that evil could wear the face of innocence. She reflected on the family portrait and admitted how blind they had been to Thomas's true nature. The smile they once believed showed chill. Good happiness was, in her words, something dark and calculating that they failed to recognize until it was nearly too late. Margaret's letters described recurring nightmares about Thomas and her constant fear that his influence might have somehow damaged her other children. She wrote that she watched them closely for signs of Thomas's nature, even though Dr. Whitmore assured her such conditions were not contagious. Still, she could not forget the way Thomas studied his siblings' fears and seemed to learn how to use them. The letters revealed that during Thomas's final years at home, the family lived in constant tension, never knowing what disturbing behavior might come next. To better understand Thomas's case from a modern perspective, Emily consulted Dr. Robert Chen, a child psychologist at Brown University. After reviewing the historical medical records, Dr. Chen explained that what early doctors observed closely matched what is now known as childhood onset conduct disorder with psychopathic traits. He explained that the mix of advanced intelligence, lack of empathy, manipulation, and enjoyment of others' suffering were classic warning signs of antisocial personality disorder developing very early in life. Dr. Chen noted how unusual Thomas's case was because of how well it had been documented at a time when child psychology was still poorly understood. The physicians treating Thomas had been careful observers, even without modern diagnostic tools. Their descriptions teached what current psychology recognizes as childhood psychopathy. Modern research, Dr. Chen explained, confirms what those records suggested. Children who show these traits so early rarely respond to treatment and often grow into adults who pose serious risks to others. Dr. Chen believed the Blackwood family's decision to institutionalize Thomas was likely the best option available, given the knowledge and treatment limits of their time. He also pointed out that the family's willingness to take such drastic action showed how severe Thomas's behavior must have been. Many families, then and now, struggle to accept that a young child can display such dangerous traits. The Blackwoods' response suggested they'd witnessed behavior that genuinely terrified them. Emily came to understand that the family portrait captured a moment when the Blackwoods were desperately trying to appear normal while coping with a child whose emotional development was fundamentally different. Thomas's grin did not represent innocence, but the satisfaction of someone who knew he was causing fear and distress and enjoyed it. After studying the enlarged image, Dr. Chen concluded that Thomas's smile was probably the most honest expression in the entire photograph. While the rest of the family struggled to maintain polite appearances, Thomas was truly enjoying himself because he knew something they were trying to hide. Emily's research into Thomas Blackwood's later life required deep investigation into institutional files, court records, and medical archives. She discovered that Thomas remained at the Rhode Island State Hospital until 1914, when he turned 16. Records from his teenage years showed continued behavioral issues and increasing skill at deceiving staff and other patients. One report noted that Thomas had become very good at appearing cooperative and reformed, while staff believed his progress was only surface level. Incidents involving other patients continued whenever he believed he was not being watched. At 16, Thomas was transferred to a specialized institution for young adults in Massachusetts, where he remained for another 4 years. Emily later found that in 1918, during World War I, many institutions released patients due to lack of funds and staff shortages. Thomas was among those released, despite doctors recommending continued supervision. His discharge papers stated that although he still showed antisocial traits, he appeared capable of functioning without direct oversight, and resources were needed for more severe cases. Scattered records suggested Thomas spent his early adult life moving from city to city across New England, never settling long enough to form lasting ties. Police files from different towns mentioned incidents involving a man named Thomas Blackwood or someone matching his description, but none led to major charges. By the mid-1920s, the trail disappeared. Emily found no marriage records, death certificates, or documents confirming his later life. Her most disturbing discovery was a series of unsolved cases from the 1920s and 1930s involving missing children and unexplained deaths in areas where Thomas had briefly lived. Although no direct evidence linked him to these cases, the pattern raised troubling questions about the consequences of his release. Emily realized she was documenting not just a family tragedy, but an example of how limited psychological understanding may have allowed a dangerous individual to move freely for decades. In her final phase of research, Emily assembled all the evidence to fully understand the story behind the Blackwood family portrait. As she reviewed the timeline of medical reports, family letters, court files, and institutional records, the meaning of Thomas's grin became clear. The photograph was taken in October 1903, when the Blackwoods were struggling to maintain appearances while secretly preparing to institutionalize their youngest child. James Blackwood had insisted on the portrait to protect the family's social image and to preserve a final record of the family before Thomas's removal made such images impossible. But Thomas seemed to understand exactly what was happening. His grin was not the smile of a child unaware of his family's pain. It was the knowing smile of someone who recognized the fear he had created and found it entertaining. The portrait captures a moment of deep family trauma hidden behind a formal pose, Emily wrote in her conclusions. While 6 family members strain to appear calm, Thomas shows genuine pleasure because he knows he is the source of their hidden distress. Emily later presented her findings at the American Historical Association's annual conference, where her work was recognized as an important contribution to understanding how families faced severe psychological disorders before modern treatment existed. She also worked with the Providence Historical Society to ensure Thomas Blackwood's story served as an educational case study on childhood psychopathy and its impact on families. Margaret Blackwood's final letter to her sister, written in 1910, offered the most painful summary of their experience. She wrote that they had learned evil could wear the face of childhood innocence, and that the most disturbing truths are sometimes hidden behind the sweetest smiles. Thomas, she wrote, taught them that not all children are born with the ability to love or feel empathy, and that accepting this truth, however painful, can be necessary to protect others. Emily's research showed that the 1903 Blackwood family portrait documented not just a formal gathering, but a moment when parents were forced to accept that one of their children posed a real danger to their family and to society. Thomas's unsettling smile hid not innocent joy, but the calculated satisfaction of someone who understood how much fear and pain he could cause, and who found that knowledge deeply pleasing. In capturing that moment, the Blackwoods unknowingly preserved one of the darkest family secrets in New England's history, the smile of a child born without empathy, who learned to use that absence as a weapon against those meant to love and protect him.